All right, we are live here at Amuse News. It's nice to see everybody. If you were on our stream a couple minutes ago that somehow didn't work, thank you for coming back. I'm your host, RJ. I have a great guest today, Chelsea Carrick, who was nominated for a James Beard Media Award for her piece in Good Beer Hunting called Waiting for the Rain, How Drought in Mexico, Northern Mexico impacts the country's beer industry. I'm going to talk about a couple of things I read, and then we'll get Chelsea out here. So the first thing I want to tell you about was an article that I read in CNN about the paleo diet. I'm not a big fad diet person, but I think we have this stereotype that ancient humans hunted large animals and ate meat. But there's new research on a Paleolithic group that's a hunter-gatherer group who were found in a cave in what's now Morocco. This is between 13,000 and 15,000 years ago. Adding to this studies adding to a growing body of evidence that challenges the notion human ancestors predominantly relied on meat. It talked about how chemical signatures found in bones and teeth led scientists to believe that maybe plants, not meat, were their primary source of protein. The evidence suggested that they were eating fermentable starchy plants such as wild cereals or acorns, not meat predominantly. But it's interesting. So maybe if we want to be more like our ancestors in ancient times, we need to eat more vegetables and grains. Okay, I also should have said at the beginning, I'm here at Roberta's, which is the birthplace of Heritage Radio Network. It's a great vibe, and everyone should come to Roberta's and have their delicious pizza and check out this spot. Another article I've been reading is from Food and Wine about what's next for culinary cannabis. So I think probably most people have seen on April 30th, the Biden administration talked about easing federal restrictions on cannabis by lowering it to a Schedule III substance. This is huge. It has implications for everyone involved with the industry, from production to sale to banking, which has been the biggest problem for cannabis companies. But Food and Wine has an article where they talk to 5 leaders in the industry about implications, which everyone should check out. Not surprisingly, they talk about the acceleration of infused beverages, seeing more infused foods and drinks available in restaurants and mainstream stores, and also allowing cannabis chefs to operate on a much bigger and more official scale. So interested to see what happens there. There's a link to that article in the show notes, as there's a link to everything in the show notes, as always. Our show, All in the Industry, had a great episode this week with Chef Alain Ducasse, which was really interesting. You all probably know who that is. He has more than 30 restaurants in 9 countries around the world and became the first chef to have 3 restaurants awarded 3 Michelin stars at the same time in 2005. Just incredible. He has a new book out called Good Taste, A Life of Food and Passion, which he talks to the host, Sherry, about. Really good article. There's another podcast episode I want to tell you about. Japan Eats has Morgan Adamson of Hoseki, which is a 6-seat omakase sushi bar in Saks Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. Morgan is a big sushi talent, and being female, she's unique to this, as the traditional sushi industry has been notorious for not welcoming females to lead the sushi counter. So good conversation there, really interesting. The last thing I want to point out is another article from Food and Wine talks about why beer tastes better cold. As we're getting into the summer, I think cold beer is essential. But apparently, when alcoholic drinks have higher concentrations of ethanol, they taste better. And when the molecules in higher concentrations of ethanol, the molecules look more like they're end-to-end in a chain-like cluster. And in drinks with lower ethanol concentrations, the molecules look more like pyramid-shaped clusters. And apparently, the ethanol clusters were pyramid-shaped when when alcohol was served at room temperature versus the chain shape served at cold. So I guess ethanol is delicious, but mostly just made me want to drink cold beer. But before I do that, let me first bring on Chelsea Carrick, who's going to talk to me again about her piece called Waiting for the Rain, How Drought in Northern Mexico Impacts the Country's Beer Industry. Chelsea, welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And congrats on being nominated for the James Beard Media Award for this piece. That's awesome.
Thanks. I appreciate it. It's pretty exciting. A lot of talented writers got nominated, so happy to be among them.
Tell us a little bit about your career, writing, and how you ended up thinking about this particular story. Can you hear me, Chelsea?
I can hear you. I think it cut out for a second, but looks like you're back.
Oh, good. Tell us a little bit about your career and your writing and how you ended up with this story.
Yeah, so I've been freelance reporting for a couple of years now, alongside various other jobs. And one of those jobs was working in Mexico. I was writing about Mexican politics. So at the time I wrote this piece, I was really tuned into the Mexican political scene, following statements by the president. So one day, President Lopez Obrador said that there will be no more beer produced in the North because the North has been suffering from extreme water shortages and horrible droughts for the past few years. So it seemed to make sense that an industry as water intensive as beer would need to shift operations, which the president said it should shift operations to the Southeast, where there's a more abundant supply of water. So I heard that, and I'd worked with Good Beer Hunting on a piece before, and initially thought maybe this would be just sort of a news piece. And my editor, Evan Rail, he worked with me on making it into a feature, and he was like, no, I think there's a lot more to this than just that simple statement. And he was right. It ended up really ballooning into something so much larger. It ended up being about US-Mexico relations, exploitation of resources. So I'm really happy with having worked with Evan and having it turned into the piece that it did.
It's really, it does touch on everything from politics to industrialization to labor and inequity and food. I mean, there's so much in here. The situation in Tijuana in particular is pretty dire with regard to water. And I didn't realize how much beer was produced in northern Mexico. And obviously, because of that drought, the industry has suffered. You describe in great detail some of the things that people are living with day to day. But just back to kind of the industry side, I didn't know that much beer was produced in Mexico. Why is it such a big production hub?
Yeah, I think most people don't really realize how much beer is produced in Mexico. You would almost think maybe German beer or Belgian beer would be more popular, but globally, Mexico leads the way. Something like 30% of the world's beer market is made up of Mexican beers. And that is led by the US. Most of what Mexico exports goes to the United States. So Mexico's leading global beer sales because of the US. Part of that is because people really like Mexican beer, and there's good reason for it. It's light, it's refreshing, it's really easy to drink. And it's pretty affordable too, compared to some other craft beers or beers from other regions. At the same time, in large part, it's so popular because there's two companies that really dominate Mexico's beer scene, and they produce a lot of beer on a massive scale. They do that in part because it's cheap to produce. The production costs and the labor costs in Mexico are cheaper than in some other places in the world. And they also have a very expansive sales network. These industrial brewers like Anheuser-Busch and Constellation Brands, they have sales networks all over the world, all throughout the US. And so it's really easy to get their product on the shelves. It's really accessible for people to buy. So that's part of why Mexican beer is so widely sold and exported.
And you mentioned when there were like major changes started happening in the beer industry, and you talked a little bit about the divergence between kind of the major breweries and the craft breweries, and you described some of these craft breweries as like neighborhood kind of based little, just basically neighborhood gathering places. And it sounds like the industry started changing quite a bit once the president made those kind of changes that you were talking about before.
Yeah, and the president's announcement impacted craft brewers differently than it did industrial brewers. The same way water shortages are impacting these two segments differently. I think when you look at the Mexican beer industry, in part, it's really two separate industries, the craft beer industry and the industrial brewing industry. For the industrial brewing industry, the president's statements were definitely directed towards them. He was saying, if you're producing beer on this kind of a scale, if you're running these massive plants, you need to do it where there's a greater abundance of water. So he was really encouraging them to try and shift operations to the Southeast, which is the case with other companies too, with other water intensive industries and with other companies more broadly, because part of the president's project is he wants to economically develop that region. However, craft breweries are also significantly impacted, not as much by the president's statements, but by the drought and by the water shortages. because they're run by people who live in these neighborhoods who don't have water coming out of their taps. The industrial breweries, they're run by people who might live in the US or Europe. They have really nothing to do with Mexico other than that they produce beer in Mexico. But the craft breweries, if their neighbors aren't getting water, they're probably not getting water either. So they have to find ways to be more efficient for their own survival, for their own sake. While as the industrial brewers, their bottom line might be impacted. Maybe water concessions are going to be more expensive, or maybe there will be political pressure for them to move. But yeah, it's basically two different industries, and they're being impacted in two completely different ways.
And we've talked a lot about the beer industry and some of the kind of businesses being affected. But like I said, you describe in the article how these droughts are affecting people, people spending hours waiting in line for water, people siphoning water out of city pipes. There's hijackings of water trucks. I mean, it sounds like it's a pretty dire situation for everyone. But how are some of the, I know there's a lot of groups in Mexico, or at least some groups that are kind of trying to fight against some of the, I guess, preferences that are given to businesses over regular people with regard to water, which gets into a whole different area of your story as well.
Yeah. There's a lot of community frustration with how water is allocated in Mexico. And the beer industry, when the president made his statement, it was a pretty politically convenient target. Because there had recently been a lot of opposition to Constellation Brands building a plant in the north. So it made sense for him to specifically call out the beer industry. But there's a lot of community pushback on various industries, other water-intensive industries like mining, for example. And also Coca-Cola has a lot of operations in Mexico. And they have a plant in Nuevo León and Monterrey, which had really horrible water shortages. People were getting water maybe one every 3 days, sometimes just for an hour at 4 a.m. But basically, Topo Chico has a plant, which is owned by Coca-Cola. They had a plant in Monterrey, and they said basically to the population, oh, don't worry, you can come get free water at our plant. So, and Coca-Cola still brags about that on their website. It's up there. You can see it as this sort of like active community activism. But then the question is, why does Coca-Cola have unlimited access to water? And most of the people in the city can't even get water for a full day, let alone more than a couple of times a week. So it's pretty easy to see how these community groups would be really frustrated with how the resource is allocated. And that's going to be directed as the water shortages worsen and as droughts worsen. That's going to be directed towards the beer industry. It's going to be directed towards Coca-Cola, but other water intensive industries as well. So I think this issue is really gaining steam right now, and we're only going to see it pick up.
And are these groups able to make progress in terms of their goals? Probably, I don't know if it's decreasing any of the favoritism that's going to some of the companies, but maybe making people pay a little more attention to the needs of regular people.
Yeah, definitely. Right now it sort of feels like symbolically, like the president made these statements about forcing industrial breweries to move south, and a lot of people were in support of that. But the truth is, nothing really tangible has happened on a policy level. Mexico hasn't made changes to its water distribution policies. So companies are still favored. And to be honest, I feel like that's going to continue, at least in the near future, because right now there are a number of companies who are shifting operations from Asia to Mexico to be closer to the US market. So even, for example, Tesla is actually opening a mega factory in Nuevo León. And that's also going to be water intensive. So even as these protests are picking up, the policies are still favoring companies. And the current administration, the López Obrador administration, is supposed to be a president of the people. That's sort of his brand. So far, very few tangible changes have happened. And so water seems to me to be at the center of this debate over who has access to resources and who controls how it's allocated. And theoretically, with this administration, it should be moving towards giving preference to citizens, but tangibly that hasn't happened yet. I do think, though, as the protests escalate, maybe there's hope that there will be more political pressure for things to change.
Yeah, I was going to ask because you wrote this article in 2023, right? So I'm just wondering, has anything materially changed since then, or is it kind of continuing to just in terms of the drought and the problems, but also any solutions? Like, has anything changed significantly since you wrote that?
Not really. The drought conditions are still bad and probably getting worse. We're about to enter summer, the hot, dry months in the north, and I'm sure that the protests at that point are going to increase. Mexico City is actually facing a worse situation than when I wrote this article. And I've seen that there's been some talk in the media about how it's reaching the point where it will not be able to produce water for its citizens. It won't be able to distribute water on that scale. And there's, in the Mexico City metropolitan area, there's 22 million people. So it's no small challenge to give water to these communities. But so far, politicians have discussed it really only symbolically and have failed to make any meaningful changes to redistribute the water.
Okay, well, let's see. Let's take this in a slightly more positive direction. Well, at least a positive direction in terms of you were nominated for an award for this, which is awesome. And honestly, like, I learned a lot reading it and learned a lot about an area of the world that's not very far away, but is like totally, there's so much in there that I didn't know. One thing that I thought was interesting, and maybe the kind of awards committees were looking at, is like, so my job, I lead this food nonprofit, and one of the things I love about this organization is that food is represented in like everything we talk about, food and beverage, right? Climate change, inequality. This, I feel like maybe what they saw in this article was like a microcosm of like every single issue you could talk about as it relates to climate. You have, and you really like show both sides of this, with people fighting, to kind of bring more equality, as well as like what the businesses are doing to try and continue to grow their businesses. I thought it was really interesting, and I'm wondering how you took that kind of like, did it grow into that big picture approach, or did you start by wanting to like map out all the different perspectives and try to make it so sweeping?
Honestly, it just turned into that. I didn't start out realizing how many directions this piece could go and how many things it could cover. It kind of grew into that. I knew that there were political implications, and I knew that I'd been following the drought for a few years at this point. So I knew all of that, but I didn't realize, I didn't know that much about how the US and Mexico negotiated their water treaties. So that was new, and that actually makes up a pretty substantial portion of the piece as well. Basically, just the way that the US is exploiting Mexico, not only through the water treaties, but also indirectly, in terms of a lot of US operations take place in Mexico, agricultural operations or, industrial production of various products. And all of those are water intensive. So Mexico isn't just sharing its resources through the water treaty with the US, but in the products that it exports back to US consumers from US companies. So really, there's a lot that I didn't know about when I started the piece. And then through my interviews and through researching different documents, I was able to see how big this story could end up being and what the implications were.
I feel like for a lot of us, like, NAFTA is a touch point, and that's kind of like the extent to which we understand U.S.-Mexico trade, and of course, like now the border, right? There's like so much, but it's not talked about holistically, in the way that you were able to do here, which is cool. I hope everyone enjoyed it and learned a lot. What else are you working on?
So I'm doing some research right now on, it's not a fully formed piece yet, and maybe it will end up being multiple pieces, but I'm really interested in food flight in former industry towns. So basically oil towns, or maybe former coal towns, where they were basically built around a single industry. The communities grew, restaurants were built, grocery stores were built. And then because these follow a boom and bust cycle, maybe these companies leave, they lay off workers, restaurants close, but not everybody wants to leave because they've spent decades building up this community. So my question that I'm kind of trying to answer is, where do these people eat? Where do they gather? In some cases, I'm seeing that the only thing left is a gas station. People are forced to shop for their groceries and even eat out at the gas station. So that's something I'm really interested in and looking into right now.
And is that in various parts of the country, or?
Yeah, I'm from Wyoming originally, so I'm more familiar with the West, which struggles a lot with the boom and bust cycle of oil. But there's also obviously West Virginian coal towns and another former industry towns throughout the country.
Yeah. Cool. We'll look forward to reading that. I have to ask you a couple quick questions to end on a fun note before I let you go. The first is what's your last best bite or last best meal you've had?
Oh, that's a really good question. I was actually just in Mexico City. Recently moved back from Mexico City to the U.S. But one of the things I wanted before I left, outside of a Walmart of all places, actually, but it sells some of the best chile relleno tacos I've ever had. And so before I left, I said, that's what I really want. And that's what I'm going to get.
Sounds delicious. Are there recipes that you brought back from your time in Mexico that you are trying to perfect or working on, or things that maybe you didn't expect to be wanting to cook?
A lot of things actually. Enchiladas of all different types, different salsas. I think what I learned the most in terms of cooking is how versatile different chilies can be and how you can make different salsas and different sauces. I guess actually my favorite sauce it's called salsa macha, which I didn't know about until I lived in Mexico. But it's originally from Veracruz, I think, and it's different kinds of chilies, whatever kinds of chilies you want, like tortilla to sort of soften it, and nuts, whatever kind of nut you want to put in, and oil.
Nice.
So it's one of my favorites.
That's awesome. That sounds really good. Well, thank you for sharing that and for coming on the show and talking about your piece. And I'll obviously link to it in the show notes for people who haven't been able to read it yet. But congrats on the nomination, and thank you again for taking a few minutes to talk.
Thank you.
And for everybody watching, we're actually going to do Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday this week. Tomorrow, I'm going to be talking with one of our hosts who just published his 600th podcast episode, Darren of Snacky Tunes. So we're going to go live tomorrow at 5, and you can obviously find this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Review, subscribe, share, all that stuff. And thank you for listening. Thanks again, Chelsea.
Thank you. Have a good day.